In this subunit, we're going to discuss how to calculate general damages. All right, let's talk about general damages. When a party breaches a contract, the non-breaching party, the aggrieved party, is entitled to general damages plus consequential and incidental damages. Let's talk about general damages. What are general damages? Well, general damages is an attempt to measure the benefit of the bargain under this contract. All right, we're going to discuss that concept in full in this subunit. So right now it just seems a little abstract. So throughout this unit, we're going to discuss the general damages for the seller or the service provider when the other party is in breach. We'll also discuss general damages for the buyer or the servicee. That's not really a word. The service recipient. Well, I'll just call it the servicee. It makes it easier. So the damages, the general damages for the buyer or the servicee when the other party is in breach. All right, first let's talk about the general damages for the seller when the buyer is in breach. So normally when we calculate the seller's general damages when the buyer is in breach, the benefit of the bargain is measured by the profit the seller would have made under the contract with the buyer. Let's look at a simple example. So Mary buys and flips houses. She buys this one house for $100,000, puts in $40,000 worth of repairs, labor, etc., so that now her investment in this house is $140,000. She enters into a contract to sell the house to Bob for $200,000. In other words, Bob promises to pay $200,000 for the house. Bob breaches the contract. Mary is able to find another buyer for only $180,000. So Bob promises to buy the house for $200,000. He breaches. Mary finds another buyer who's willing to pay $180,000. Bob has breached. Bob owes Mary general damages, which is the benefit of the bargain between Bob and Mary. Remember, our whole goal is to put Mary in as good a position she would have been had the contract been performed. So, if the contract had been performed, if Bob had performed his promise, Mary would have had $200,000. But she had invested $140,000 in the house, which means Mary would have been $60,000 better off. All right? So what happens after Bob breaches the contract? Well, Mary is able to sell the house, but only for $180,000. So how much better off is she under the second contract? Well, she's only $40,000 better off after the second contract. $180,000 minus $40,000. She's made a $40,000, minus $140,000. She's made a $40,000 profit under the second contract. Under the contract with Bob, she would have made a $60,000 profit. So how much does Bob have to pay Mary? Well, Bob has to pay Mary $20,000. With the $40,000 of profit that she had under the second contract, plus the $20,000 that Bob will pay her as general damages, Mary will be made whole. She will make a profit of $60,000. All right, let's talk about what damages a service provider will be entitled to when the other party is in breach of contract. Basically, the calculation is the same that we saw when the seller is the aggrieved party and the buyer has breached the contract. The benefit of the bargain, the general damages, which we measure by the benefit of the bargain, will be that service provider's profit under the contract. What profit would the service provider have made under the contract? So here we have a little hypothetical. Homeowner and contractor enter into a contract for the building of an addition to the homeowner's existing home. The contract price is $100,000. Homeowner repudiates the contract before contractor has begun performance. Contractor's total expenses under the contract would have been $75,000. So we do a little math. We see that the contract price is $100,000. Contractor would have had expenses of $75,000. This means that the contractor would have made a profit of $25,000 under the contract. This is the benefit of the bargain. This is the general damages. And so the question is, what are contractors' damages? The answer is $25,000. Why? Because if the homeowner had performed as promised, contractor would have made a profit of $25,000. Contractor would have been $25,000 better off. Let's look at an example of calculating the benefit of the bargain. Here's our hypothetical. Homeowner hires house painter to paint her house for $10,000. House painter's expenses for the job will be $6,000. So under this scenario, if homeowner breaches the contract, house painter's benefit under the bargain is $4,000, right? Because the contract price is $10,000 and house painter's expenses for the job will be $6,000. Let's look at several possible scenarios. Here's the first scenario. Homeowner repudiates before house painter does anything. Here's the second scenario. Homeowner repudiates before house painter does anything. Homeowner had paid $1,500 to house painter when they signed the contract. Homeowner repudiates after a week. House painter had already painted one room, the expenses for which totaled $1,000. Homeowner repudiates after a week. House painter has already painted one room, the expenses for which totaled $1,000. Homeowner had paid $1,500 to house painter when they signed the contract. So let's go to the first one again. The first one's the most simple because it just asks us to calculate the benefit of the bargain for house painter. So we already did that. Contract price is $10,000. House painter's expenses are $6,000. If homeowner repudiates before house painter does anything, homeowner owes house painter $4,000 in damages for contract breach. All right, so what about the second scenario where homeowner repudiates before house painter does anything? Homeowner had already paid $1,500 to house painter when they signed the contract as a down payment. Well, we still have to make sure that house painter is put in as good a position she would have been had the contract been performed. The position she would have been in had homeowner performed this contract is house painter would have been $4,000 better off. So house painter already has $1,500. So to make her $4,000 better off, we just have to give her $2,500. So under this second scenario, homeowner is liable to house painter for $2,500 in contract damages. The $2,500 plus the $1,500 gives the house painter her $4,000 benefit of the bargain. All right, the next scenario, homeowner repudiates after a week. House painter had already painted one room, the expenses for which totaled $1,000. So here, house painter has already incurred expenses. We want to make sure that house painter winds up $4,000 better off. If we give house painter $4,000 under this situation, where house painter has already spent $1,000, then it's $4,000 minus $1,000. House painter will only be $3,000 better off if we just give her $4,000. So, how much do we have to award her? That's right, $5,000. So, under this scenario, homeowner is liable for $5,000 for breach of contract. Finally, homeowner repudiates after a week. House painter has already painted one room, the expenses for which total $1,000. Homeowners paid $1,500 to house painter when they signed the contract. So we're still trying to make it so that house painter is $4,000 better off than before she entered into the contract. This is a combination of the previous two scenarios. To make house painter $4,000 better off, well, we're going to have to add $1,000 for those expenses, which is $5,000. But house painter has already received $1,500, so we subtract that. Homeowner will be liable to house painter for $3,500 for breach of contract. Let's look at another example. This one's a little bit more difficult, but it's not too difficult. So this is a contract for the sale of real estate. Seller and buyer enter into a contract for the sale of a house for $100,000. The contract price is $100,000. Seller's closing costs and other expenses will be $5,000. So what is seller's net under this contract? Well, seller's net under this contract will be $95,000. Seller will receive $100,000 from buyer and will have costs and expenses of $5,000, which means seller will net $5,000. Well, what happens? Buyer repudiates the contract before law day. Seller had not paid for any expenses. Seller sells the house to a new buyer. Seller goes out and finds substitute performance, but can only get $80,000 for the house. Seller pays $4,000 closing costs at the closing of the sale with the new buyer. All right, so our original buyer is in breach of contract. How much will she owe the seller? Well, once again, remember, under the original contract, seller would have been $95,000 better off. $100,000 contract price minus $5,000 in expenses. Where was seller after the breach? Well, seller was only able to get $80,000 minus $4,000. Seller was only able to net $76,000. So she would have been $95,000 better off. She was only $76,000 better off. How much does buyer owe her for her breach? It's just $95,000 minus $76,000. It's $19,000. So buyer is liable to seller for $19,000 in damages for breach of contract. Let's change the facts a little bit. Same facts, contract price $100,000, seller's expenses will be $5,000. Buyer repudiates the contract before law day, but seller had already paid $1,000 in expenses. Maybe she had given $1,000 to a lawyer or a land survey or something like that before buyer repudiated. Seller sells the house to a new buyer, but she can only get $80,000. Seller pays $4,000 at closing costs at the closing of the sale. Okay, so we know the basic fact pattern is that if buyer had performed as promised, seller would have been $95,000 better off, and because buyer breached, seller was only $76,000 better off. So it's a net of $19,000. Buyer must compensate seller $19,000. But here, seller has already paid $1,000 in expenses. If we give seller $19,000, then seller is only $18,000 better off. Why? Because buyer compensates seller $19,000, but seller has already paid $1,000 in expenses under this contract. So giving seller $19,000 in this situation doesn't put seller in as good a position she would have been had the contract been performed. So because seller had already paid $1,000 in expenses and could not recover those, we have to give seller $20,000. So under the second fact pattern, buyer will be liable to seller for $20,000 in contract damages because buyer breached the contract. Here's another scenario. We have a contract between contractor and homeowner to build a home addition for $100,000. The contract price is $100,000. Homeowner repudiates the contract after contractor had already installed $10,000 worth of materials in the home. Contractor's total expenses for the project, including the $10,000 already incurred, would have been $75,000. All right, so let's do the easiest part first. What is contractor's profit under this contract? Well, the contract price is $100,000. Contractor's expenses for the project would have been $75,000. So contractor would have profited $25,000 under this contract. So what are contractor's damages under this situation? Don't forget, contractor had already spent $10,000 on this project. So to make it so that contractor benefits $25,000, how much do we have to pay contractor? How much does homeowner have to pay contractor in damages? The answer is $35,000. Do you see why? Well, here's the explanation. Contractor's profit under the transaction would have been $25,000. We agree to that, right? Contract price $100,000. Contractor's expenses would have been $75,000. That makes a profit of $25,000. But contractor's already spent $10,000. If we just award contractor with $25,000 and contractor has already spent $10,000, then contractor doesn't wind up $25,000 better off. Contractor only winds up $15,000 better off. Why? Because buyer pays $25,000 in damages, but contractor has already had $10,000 in out-of-pocket expenses. So we have to award contractor $35,000, which will ensure that contractor profits $25,000 under this situation. It makes sure that contractor receives a benefit of the bargain of $25,000. Okay, here's a variation of the previous fact pattern. Everything is pretty much the same except one fact. So we have a contract between contractor and homeowner to build a home addition for $100,000. That's the contract price. Homeowner repudiates after contract had already purchased $10,000 worth of lumber for the home. The materials are all in contractor's warehouse. Contractor's total expenses for the project would have been $25,000. So we have the same fact pattern. Contractor would have profited $25,000 under this contract. But the difference in this variation is that contractor has made some purchases for this project, has incurred $10,000 worth of expenses. But here, the materials are all still in contractor's warehouse. That lumber is still in contractor's possession, and contractor can use that lumber for another job. So we're assuming that the $10,000 worth of lumber that contractor has purchased is still worth $10,000. What are contractor's damages? Well, here, contractor's damages are only $25,000. And you might say, but wait, contractor had an expense of $10,000. And the last time we did that, last time we saw that, we added that on to the damages, made it $35,000. But in this case, we won't. Why? Because although contractor has purchased $10,000 worth of lumber, which is an expense out, it has assets coming in of $10,000, lumber. And so that transaction is a wash for contractor. Even though contractor has expended that money and doesn't have the cash, contractor still has $10,000 worth of lumber. So that is a wash when we calculate damages. So in this case, to make sure that contractor winds up $25,000 better off after homeowner's breach, we award contractor $25,000 in damages. Homeowner will have to pay contractor $25,000 in damages for her breach of contract. All right, let's practice applying what we just learned Here's a fact pattern. It's very similar to the last fact pattern. We have a builder who agrees to build a house on owner's land for $100,000, all inclusive. Builder can show that its entire expenses for building the house would have been $80,000. So we see that builder would have made a $20,000 profit under this contract. Owner repudiates the contractor after builder purchased $10,000 worth of materials, which are in builder's possession. The materials are still worth $10,000. So what are contractors' damages? Your choice is between $20,000 and $30,000. Which one is it? That's right, it's $20,000. Why? Well, the $10,000 in materials should be treated as a wash. It's neutral. It is an expense for builder, but it's also an asset coming in. So it doesn't make builder any better off or any worse off. It keeps builder neutral. So we have to make sure that builder profits $20,000 under this contract, and by awarding her $20,000, she will benefit $20,000. So owner has to pay contractor $20,000 in contract damages. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the situation where the buyer or the service recipient is the aggrieved party and the seller or the service provider is the breaching party. Now, this is a little bit different. It's a little bit more difficult to calculate the benefit of the bargain for the aggrieved buyer or the aggrieved service recipient. Why? Well, because a buyer doesn't make a profit under this contract. A seller makes a profit under this contract, right? There's seller's costs of acquiring whatever is being sold, and then there is the contract price. So if the contract price is higher than the cost of acquiring the object of the contract, then the seller will make a profit. Same for a service provider, right? There's the contract price, and then there's the cost of providing the service. If the contract price is higher than the cost of providing the service provider will make a profit. A buyer doesn't make a profit under this contract. A buyer just pays the contract price. Same with the service recipient. The service recipient doesn't make a profit under this contract. It just pays the contract price. So now the question is, how do we measure the benefit of the bargain? How do we measure general damages? Well, we still can. What we do is we look at the cost of substitute performance. If the cost of substitute performance is greater than the contract price, then the buyer or the service recipient is entitled to the difference. Here's a little example. So let's say that in our contract between buyer and seller, or between service recipient and service provider, the contract price is $10,000. And then the seller or the service provider breaches the contract. The service recipient or the buyer has to go out and get those services or that object from another seller or another service provider, and it costs that party, the aggrieved party, the buyer or the service recipient, $12,000 under this new contract to find substitute performance. Well, because the original contract price was $10,000, because the cost of substitute performance was $12,000, now the aggrieved buyer or the aggrieved service recipient is entitled to $2,000 in damages, the difference between substitute performance and the contract price. If substitute performance had been the same as the contract price, if substitute performance had been $10,000, then the aggrieved party would be entitled to no damages. Let's look at this fact pattern. Homeowners Association hires landscaper for 1 year at $20,000 and pays landscaper a $5,000 deposit at the signing of the contract. So we have a contract between Homeowners Association and a landscaper. The contract price is $20,000, and Homeowners Association paid a $5,000 deposit at the signing of the contract. Landscaper repudiates the contract before any performance. Homeowners Association gets replacement landscaper for $23,000. Now, remember, it is more difficult to calculate the benefit of the bargain for a buyer or a service recipient because they will not make a profit under this contract. So what profit does Homeowners Association make under this contract? None. It's just a $20,000 expense for them. But we can measure the benefit of the bargain by measuring it against substitute performance. And here the Homeowners Association went out and got substitute performance for $23,000 when the landscaper repudiated the contract. So what are the Homeowners Association damages here? Well, let's look at the facts. Contract price, $20,000. Substitute performance, $23,000. So far, we have to give Homeowners Association $23,000 to put the Homeowners Association in as good a position it would have been had the landscaper performed the promise. If the landscaper had performed the promise, according to the contract, the Homeowners Association would have got a year of landscaping services for $20,000. Because of the breach, the Homeowners Association gets landscaping services for a year for $23,000. And so, the landscaper is going to be liable to Homeowners Association for that $3,000 difference. But wait, the Homeowners Association also paid the landscaper $5,000 deposit. So, the landscaper has to give that back. So to put the Homeowners Association in as good a position it would have been had the landscaper performed the contract, we have to give the Homeowners Association $8,000. Right? You see that? It's just the $3,000 difference in the substitute performance plus the $5,000 deposit that Homeowners Association already paid the landscaper. Not too difficult, right? Let's look at another example. In this example, we have a seller and a buyer. They enter into the contract for the sale and purchase of a house for $100,000. A real estate contract, sale for $100,000. The contract price is $100,000. Seller learns the house is worth $120,000 and repudiates the contract. Buyer paid $1,000 for a home inspection before seller's repudiation. This was a necessary expense. Okay, let's get the lay of the land before we go into calculating the damages. So here we have an aggrieved buyer. And once again, it's more difficult to determine the benefit of the bargain for the aggrieved buyer because a buyer will not make a profit under the contract. But here we can see that buyer would have made a profit, quote unquote profit under the contract. If the transaction had gone through, buyer would have bought a house worth $120,000 for $100,000. So buyer would have been $20,000 better off. You understand why? Contract price, $100,000, and for that, I'm getting a house worth $120,000. And therefore, if we had gone through with this contract and I'm the buyer, I would have been $20,000 better off. But wait, that's only half the story. Buyer would have had expenses for this transaction. So even though we can say, there would have been a profit of $20,000, there wouldn't have been a profit of $20,000. Buyer had a $1,000 expense for this transaction, which he would have had. So it means that buyer's quote-unquote profit or benefit of the bargain under this transaction would have only been $19,000. Here's how we calculate that. Buyer's purchase price is $100,000, which goes to seller naturally, but it's $100,000. That's one expense. There's another expense in this contract for buyer, and that's the home inspection. Even though that money doesn't go to seller, that is money that buyer has to pay in relation to this transaction. That's an expense for buyer under this transaction. So just based on this fact pattern, buyer has two itemized expenses for this transaction. One, $100,000 contract price, and two, $1,000 home inspection. So Buyer's expenses under this contract are $101,000. What is she going to get for that? She's going to get a house worth $120,000. So buyer's profit under this transaction, quote unquote profit, or buyer's benefit of the bargain under this transaction would have been $19,000. So we have to make it so that she is $19,000 better off. Are we going to give her $19,000? No, we're going to give her $20,000. And why is that? Well, we're going to give her $20,000 because she's already paid $1,000 out of her pocket. So if we give $20,000 to her and she's already spent $1,000, that means she is $19,000 better off. So under this transaction, seller will owe buyer $20,000 in damages for seller's breach of this contract. All right, let's look at the same basic fact pattern, except let's go to the third line. In this case, buyer learns of seller's repudiation before she pays the $1,000 for a home inspection, which was a necessary expense. Okay, this doesn't change our basic starting calculation. What is buyer's benefit of the bargain? Well, buyer's expenses for this contract are $101,000. What will she get? She'll get a house worth $120,000. This transaction will make her $19,000 better off. So, how much money do we have to give her? Well, she hasn't spent that $1,000. So she hasn't incurred that expense yet. So this one is more straightforward. Buyer's damages under this contract are only $19,000, right? Buyer's profit would have been $19,000 under this contract. The benefit of the bargain for her would have been $19,000. She hasn't actually incurred any of those expenses, so we don't have to compensate her for any of those expenses to make her $19,000 better off. So under this contract, seller will have to pay $19,000 in damages to buyer for seller's breach. Okay, continuing on with this basic fact pattern, we have seller and buyer. They're entering into the contract for the sale and purchase of a house for $100,000. Seller learns the house is worth $120,000 and repudiates the contract. Buyer paid $1,000 for a home inspection before seller's repudiation. This home inspection was a necessary expense. Buyer also paid a down payment of $10,000 to seller. What are buyer's damages? Well, let's figure it out again. How much would buyer have benefited under this contract? Or what would buyer's benefit of the bargain be? We already said it would have been $19,000. Why? Buyer has $101,000 of expenses for this contract and will receive a house worth $120,000. $120,000 minus $101,000 is $19,000. But buyer has paid $1,000 for those expenses. We already learned that we have to add that back in because this has been an expense that buyer has incurred. So we have to add that back in. That would give us $20,000. And buyer has also had another expense, an expense of $10,000 down payment on the house. So we have to add that in too. Buyer's damages will be $30,000. Seller, under this contract, will have to pay buyer $30,000 in damages for seller's breach, right? Part of that is just returning the $10,000 that seller has received. The other part of it is making sure that buyer is $19,000 better off after this transaction, which, because buyer has incurred $1,000 in expenses, seller has to pay $20,000 in damages for that. So $20,000 plus $10,000 equals $30,000. Same basic fact pattern, except there's one change here. Look at the third line. In this fact pattern, buyer learns of seller's repudiation before she pays the $1,000 for a home inspection and necessary expense. So this will still be an expense under the contract, and so buyer's expenses for this contract would still be $101,000, and she would receive a house worth $120,000, which means she would be $19,000 better off if seller had not breached this contract. But in this case, she hasn't actually incurred that $1,000 expense, so we don't have to compensate her for that. We're focusing in just on the $19,000, and so we have to give her that $19,000, award her those in damages, plus, of course, seller has to return that $10,000 to buyer that buyer paid as a down payment. And so buyer's damages under this scenario are $29,000. Seller must pay buyer $29,000 in damages for seller's breach of this contract. Just one quick note about the burden of proof for general damages. The plaintiff, the aggrieved party, has the burden to prove the general damages with reasonable certainty.